When Sadness is at Your Door, written and illustrated by Ava Eland. Sometimes sadness arrives unexpectedly. It follows you around and sits so close to you, you can hardly breathe. You can try to hide it, but it feels like you've become sadness yourself. Try not to be afraid of sadness. Give it a name. Listen to it. Ask it where it comes from and what it needs. If you don't understand each other, just sit together and be quiet for a while. Find something that you both enjoy, like drawing, like listening to music or drinking hot chocolate. Maybe sadness doesn't like to stay inside. Try letting it out sometimes. Go for a walk through the trees. You can listen to their sounds together. Maybe all it wants to know is that it is welcome. And to sleep, knowing it is not alone. When you wake up, it might be gone. Don't worry. Today is a new day. So this morning, I want to share with you one of the most exciting things for me from sabbatical. So this is about a type of therapy. I learned about it not by working with a therapist, but by working with a spiritual director. As part of my sabbatical time, I met with a spiritual director every 2 weeks for spiritual reflection and guidance. Early in my sabbatical, I would talk with my spiritual director about the discomfort I felt when I wasn't working. Some of you may recognize that feeling. I told her, even though I know I'm tired and I need this rest, there's still a voice in my head that says it's lazy to sit around doing nothing. And I went on to tell her, I don't know where that voice comes from. Maybe it's the voice of my mom. Sorry, Mom. But my spiritual director spoke up. No, she said, all the voices and messages we hear in our head are our own voices. Now, this may not seem like a radical idea, but I found it astonishing. I have always felt comfortable attributing a certain amount of my thoughts or feelings as coming from outside myself, coming from the way I was raised, or being part of Generation X, or teachings of the dominant culture, and so on. The idea that it was all me felt new and interesting, and so I asked to learn more. What she talked with me about, and what I went on to read about, and what I'm currently taking an online class in, is called Internal Family Systems Therapy. But I'm not a therapist, and I'm going to be sharing with you some of the teachings and ideas from this way of understanding the mind. But I don't feel like I'm going to be telling you a lot about the therapeutic practices. So let's call this Internal Family Systems Thinking. IFS thinking. So there are a lot of different types of therapy. If you've ever looked at a therapist directory online, you can often filter the therapists by types of therapy: psychoanalytic, hypnotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and so on. So there are dozens and perhaps hundreds of different types of therapy. IFS therapy is what's called an evidence-based therapy, meaning it has been shown to be effective in clinical studies, and it's been around for about 40 years. I find its model for understanding the mind to be very synchronous with many of our Unitarian Universalist beliefs, and I'll get to that. First, in IFS, the framework for understanding the mind is that the mind is made up of the self and parts. We already use this language of parts organically, and I'm hoping after today, you'll start to hear it, you'll start to notice it. So remember, I said there was a voice in my head telling me I was lazy, a judgy voice so that says I'm lazy when I'm not working. That judgy voice is one of my parts. So if you've ever said something like, part of me is really looking forward to going to the party, but part of me would love to stay home and read a book. You have an outgoing part that likes to be around people, and you have a part that prefers being alone. And these parts are sometimes in conflict with each other. And it's through this kind of ordinary language that we already use. This is exactly how this theory of the mind was developed. And this type of therapy was from a therapist who heard his patients, clients talking this way. So we have these parts, and all our parts are different from each other. So it's not like there's a list of parts and I would say, here's the parts we all have. That's not it. You will naturally know your own parts the best, just as I know mine. And even when we have some similarities, what your part looks like and sounds like in there is going to be different from mine. It is likely that we have some similar parts. Many people have an inner critic, possibly multiple inner critics. We have perfectionist parts, worried parts. Our story today was about having a sad part of ourselves show up. That story was a beautiful illustration that we don't have to think of everything as coming from inside, and we can, be friendly towards a part we're getting to know and companion it while we learn about it. Our parts have their own agendas, their own work they're trying to accomplish, and sometimes they work well with each other, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes we have conflicting parts, and we recognize when that happens because we end up feeling stuck or confused or like we aren't sure what to do. So I was experiencing a lot of that early in my sabbatical. Like I had multiple parts that were had opinions about what it's like to be not working. And then we all have a self, that self with a capital S. And the self in each of us has these 8 qualities: calm, compassionate, confident, connected, courageous, creative, curious, and having clarity. That all by itself is a pretty radical statement, I think. We each have a self in us that is calm, compassionate, confident, connected, courageous, creative, curious, and has clarity. You might know people who don't seem to have these qualities at all. Or don't seem able to access these qualities easily. Sometimes people come to this therapy not believing that there is a part of themselves with these qualities. It is possible to live our lives very disconnected from this self. And I think there are people who live very disconnected from this self, and that it's a very painful way to live. But most of us, hopefully, are able to access that self at least some of the time. And as we go about our day, our self and our parts are working together like a family system, an internal family system. working away to do the things we need to do to get through the day and live our lives. Get up, eat breakfast, get dressed, all of the things. So in an optimal system, I'll get to this later, but IFS doesn't use the language of brokenness or ill or needing healing. So I love that about it. And so, listen to these word choices. In an optimal system, the self is the leader of the system. Remember, all of our parts have their own agendas and concerns. We might have an organizer part that wants everything to be orderly, and our judgy parts has lots of opinions about the right and wrong way of doing things. We might have a perfectionist part who can't bear it if certain things aren't done in a certain way. These parts on their own can't always figure out how to work together. And so our internal family system works best when it is led by the self that is calm, compassionate, confident, connected, courageous, creative, curious, and has clarity. So I have a great example for you of what this might look like. So we have a commercial. I mean, this isn't related to IFS, except that it's the perfect illustration of IFS. So this is a commercial from a real estate app, and it accidentally illustrates the internal family system of the self and the parts really well. So we'll watch it.
Okay, listen up. Selling our place, buying this place. Thoughts. Negative me.
No. Shouldn't have started with you.
Spontaneous me.
Already ordering drapes.
Paranoid me.
Why are you asking me?
Antisocial me.
Wow, I'm rude. Lazy me?
Lazy me.
We gotta sell our place, sort out finances.
Stressed me.
Wow, okay.
Does anybody have anything helpful? Helpful me.
Hi, we don't need to stress about lining it all up. Zillow can help with that.
And that's why you're my favorite me.
I thought I was your favorite me.
Oh, you totally are.
Gullible me.
Me. Me. Me.
Me.
Me.
Me.
Me. Me. Me. Me. Me. Me. Me. Me. Me.
I think the name of the company behind her is Susan's Co. That was Susan. So you can see that someone was running that meeting, right? Calling on all the different parts for their input. And IFS, the part that runs the meeting, is hopefully the self. Now, I say hopefully the self is leading the system, but we know that that's not always true, right? Even for those of us who are in touch with that part of ourselves, I doubt that any of us feels that our self, with all of those lovely characteristics, is always the part that's running things. Sometimes angry me jumps up and takes over the meeting of parts. Or worried me. A lot of us were in touch with our worried parts this week, weren't we? Many of us didn't feel calm, confident, and curious this week. Or sometimes the part of me that thinks it's a good idea to watch hours and hours of television takes over, and it's not myself with its clarity that's running things. So there are lots of different metaphors that get used to describe the internal family system, and there's not a right one, a wrong one, or a perfect one. We just saw this system operating as like a meeting in a conference room. Another image that gets used sometimes is a group of people on a bus with the self driving the bus, or sometimes another part shoves the self aside and takes over driving. I'm coming to like the image of an orchestra with a conductor. With the conductor leading things, the self, the musicians work together to create beautiful music. Sometimes some instruments are louder as the music rises and falls. Not all instruments play all of the time in an orchestra, right? We don't need all of our parts working away all of the time. So imagine then how things can go wrong. What if some instrumentalists insist on playing louder, ignoring the conductor, or some instrumentalists refuse to play their part when it's time? Imagine someone shoving the conductor aside and trying to lead the orchestra themselves, but that person, that part, that musician, doesn't know how to be a conductor. All they know is how to play their own instrument. This is what it's like when our parts try to lead themselves, when they ignore the self or don't trust the self. It can be a little chaotic, and I suspect that most of us have had times in our lives when our inner world felt chaotic. We've had times when we've done something or said something without fully understanding why we did or said that thing. Isn't that what meditation is about? Quieting the cacophony of our parts and maybe listening deeply for the voice of the self, the calm, compassionate, connected self. So now here's one of the most important things to understand about your parts, and this is a central tenet of IFS thinking. There's a whole book with this title. There are no bad parts. So this might feel counterintuitive at first. Most of us have things we would change about ourselves if we could. And if someone is shoving aside the conductor of the orchestra and trying to lead, that doesn't sound good. But this to me, is why the orchestra image works well, because we don't really think that one musician is evil or wants to hurt everyone else. That part just wants to make beautiful music. And it thinks that their instrument is the most important one. So that part thinks it's doing the right thing by taking over and playing louder than everyone else. This is true for even very troubling behaviors like addiction. Addiction behaviors, numbing behaviors, these are things we do to avoid facing hurt, facing hard decisions, avoid facing painful memories, avoid debilitating doubts and insecurities. The part of us that is encouraging that behavior, whatever it is, drinking, substance use, risky activities, playing games all day, watching TV all day, that part is trying to be helpful in keeping you from feeling pain or discomfort. So it wants to distract you with these other activities. But just like the tuba player shoving aside the conductor, good intentions don't necessarily produce good outcomes. So another word that's used for parts is protectors. Our parts are trying to protect us from pain and discomfort and hardship. The work that's done in therapy is to get to know your parts and then to learn what it is they're trying to protect you from. It is often painful memories that originate from childhood experiences or other kinds of traumatic experiences. This is considered by many people to be a very good therapy for addressing trauma and traumatic experiences. So IFS does not use the language that suggests we are broken or ill in any way. When we talk about parts, about protectors that aren't functioning optimally, we talk about them having developed an extreme or oppressive belief, and we talk about them being burdened. So the therapeutic work is to unburden the protector. So for example, I mentioned having a judgy part. A judge part can be helpful in living daily life, helping to evaluate decisions and activities. What should we do? What's a good use of our time? But mine had become a little extreme, judging me for resting even when I needed rest. So we consider that an extreme belief, an oppressive belief. When I was getting to know that part, and I asked it what it was afraid would happen if it didn't do its job, so I was trying to get to know it. The answer was, this is what the judge thought, was that there would be chaos if it didn't do its job. My judging part really felt that its work was important, like the most important work of the whole system. So I did the therapeutic work with that part, which is complicated and not something we're going to cover here. But I will say that part of that work is helping the part, the protector, learn to trust the self as the leader of the system, and to trust that the self can do some of the work that the part used to do. So, the self is a pretty good evaluator of what's a good use of time as well. So we approach our parts with love, compassion, and gratitude, always, even when their behavior is behavior we hope to change. And that helps the part lay down its burden so it can begin to function in a way that's more harmonious with the rest of the system, the rest of the orchestra. So if I judged my judging part, that wouldn't be the self, because the self doesn't judge. So if I were judging my judging part, that would be another part. It gets like that really fast. There's a part judging my judging part. Okay, because here's the thing, this is why this is my first sermon coming back from sabbatical. Our parts are exhausted. All of our parts are exhausted. They teach this in IFS therapy even before the pandemic, that people's parts get exhausted. And so post-pandemic, I feel like that's our situation. The pandemic has exhausted us in a way that most of us have never experienced before, and that the regular things we do to rest and recuperate will not be enough. I can tell you that after a month of sabbatical, I did not feel significantly different than the first day of sabbatical. And I've heard this from other ministers who have been fortunate enough to take substantial time off. I had to learn how to unburden my parts and how to rest my parts. So there are IFS trained therapists you can work with, but there's also permission to do IFS work on your own. And there are books to support you in doing this. I'm happy to make recommendations if you are interested in learning more. But these are the ideas in IFS that seem important to me for us as Unitarian Universalists. That we are inherently whole, not broken. That we are our own sources of transformation. That love, compassion, and gratitude are gateways to unburdening pain and suffering. That spiritual practices can be understood as working to help quiet the chatter of our parts and to strengthen our sense of self. Spiritual practices help parts know and trust the self. And that this framework might help us better understand the pain and suffering of people we know or see in the world who have lost touch with their self. It's my most fervent hope that some of these ideas may be helpful to you in some way as you make sense of your own life and your own ways of being in the world. May it be so. You're invited to rise in body or spirit to join in singing.